The following is a special series of the Darden Ideas to Action podcast, focusing on the power of disruptive innovations.
Good Disruption, a lively discussion between UVA Darden School of Business professors Yael Grushka-Cocaine and Mike Lennox on cutting-edge technologies and practices that are challenging the status quo.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Yael and welcome to Good Disruption. Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited about tonight's topic.
Oh, tell us more. I know that you're very passionate about it. I'm excited to see you this passionate about it. What are we talking about
Well,
today?
really, our researcher, Becky, is the most passionate about this. But the topic is clean meat, which is a reference to lab-grown beef or other types of meats. And if that sounds, I don't know, science fiction, I'm here to tell you that this is becoming more and more of a reality. But before we jump in, I want to talk about something completely unrelated, which is continuing my push to how we can popularize our podcast.
Okay, good. What's your latest idea?
So
Get the cows to hum it in the field?
Oh, I like that. That actually wasn't where I was going. But I was thinking about how I made a reference to Jason Bateman being my doppelganger in a previous session. And it made me thinking about doppelgangers in a podcast world. So I'm thinking, obviously, you don't need a video doppelganger. You need an audio doppelganger. So who could be our audio doppelgangers that we could then post on our website and have Instagram feeds about? And so I've got a good one for you.
Ooh,
and I'm curious
excited.
your thoughts for me. The one I have for you is in some ways way too obvious and reflects my complete lack of knowledge of Israeli celebrities.
Okay, good.
So I'm going with Gal Gadot.
Oh, that's good. I'll take that as a
You
compliment.
got the
Yes,
Israeli
yes,
accent. It really,
yes,
that
yes.
works. So I don't know where in the world you'd go for me
that is a hard
on my
one.
audio doppelganger.
I'm going to have to work on that.
You're going to have to think about that
I'm going
one?
to have to think about that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Not like
good.
James Earl Jones or I don't know. Yeah, my voice isn't that deep. The Rock would be cool.
The Rock?
Yeah.
He is. He shows up in Charlottesville from time to time.
He does. He does have a house here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe
But
we can work on
He
that.
doesn't have the same accent.
All right.
So.
Well, we're going to get Mark Wahlberg in here, and we're going to get The Rock
That's
in
really
here
who you
on
want.
our
Yes,
on our
okay,
podcast.
I love it.
But I digress. So we talk about clean meat.
Yeah, tell me about clean meat. What is it that fascinates Becky so much?
Yeah, so this gets into some of the work we've done together on decarbonization. We have a book, just to self-promote here, on the decarbonization imperative we published together. And so when we started looking at our decarbonization challenge, we broke it down by sectors. So there's things like transportation and electrical generation, energy generation. But one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases that I think is not appreciated is agriculture. It's actually about a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, and 2/3 of that comes from livestock. So you may have heard about, cows farting and belching. It actually is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. It's actually two things. It's enteric fermentation, which is reference to belching of cows and the ways their stomachs work, and then also manure, so manure management. And in both cases, they release methane, which goes up and is a significant greenhouse gas, actually more significant than CO2 in terms of its impact.
My daughter will get a kick out of the fact that our podcast is talking about poo and farts.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Basically.
We've digressed to that point
great.
there. So the question becomes, given how much livestock is consumed in our world, in our society, what can we do? So there's a lot of interesting solutions working directly with the cows. Genetic breeding to try to get them to have less belching. There is the idea of probiotics, the use of seaweed as a feed, all of these to try to reduce the amount that they make.
But that's still not clean meat.
Still not clean meat. And in fact, the more obvious solution would be substitution. So maybe people would just stop consuming meat. That might seem a little unrealistic, given at least Americans' taste, but other parts of the world as well. We have seen, of course, veggie burgers and the like. They were introduced all the way back in the 1980s, but now we've seen the growth of companies like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, who've really made some great traction in creating products that really mimic beef, products here. And so you see that whether it be at Burger King with the Impossible Whopper and the like, and that's really grown. The other big area we've seen is alternative dairy. So in the United States now, we're up to 15%, over 15% of milk consumption is alternative dairy. So oat milk and almond milk and the like here. But these are only substitutes so far. And there are those who still, love a good steak or burger. Are you one of those?
I am definitely one of those.
Yeah, my wife is actually vegan, so I say I'm vegan adjacent. But I, even knowing the impacts that livestock and beef have, still like to consume, a burger and a steak on occasion. So this is where clean meat comes in. So this is the idea of using lab-grown meat. So it's the same cellular constituency of what a livestock would be, grown in the laboratory, grown in a production facility, so it doesn't have those methane emissions, doesn't have the, as we're saying, pooping and and belching parts of the equation. And again, this is real. There's lots of money coming into it, and it's growing, every year here.
So it's exciting and yet freaky at the same time.
Yeah.
Thinking about eating something that is coming from a lab seems, to me, just so much less preferred than getting something from nature. So, like humans, the cows need to function in certain ways, and all of those bodily functions are intended for certain purposes.
Yeah.
How is it that we would get away with it, or how is it that it would possibly be good for us as humans to grow things in the lab in this artificial way?
Well, again, from at least an environmental standpoint, we're, removing those greenhouse gases. There's also hopes for just kind of efficiency. Think about land use, the amount of land used to grow feedstocks for cattle and cows that would be reduced. You can have arguably a much more efficient energy-wise and otherwise facility with this.
Why not move to different kind of animals? So, for instance, either consume different meats, so develop different habits. There's a lot of other animals. I visited Sweden earlier in the year, and the meatballs there are made out of bear, are made out of deer, are made out of many different animals. Maybe that's an alternative. And in a similar vein, I know that there's a lot of efforts around insects and grasshoppers and getting protein from alternative sources like that. That seems still natural and not lab created. So why not go that route?
Yeah, and I think the premise here is we love our burgers, we love our steaks, and it's very hard to get us off of that. In fact, one of the things we have seen throughout societies around the world is that as they become more economically developed and they have a higher income levels, people do tend to want to have a more protein-rich diet, and that often means more consumption of meat, pork, beef, chicken, and the like. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, the easy solution would be just substitute away. The reality is there's a huge demand for this, and so this is an alternative approach. So let me put some numbers on this. So we really haven't been that long that we've been trying to develop this technology. So in 2013, a Dutch scientist, Mark Post, came up with the first burger, if you will, that was a lab-grown burger. To put it in perspective, and this is a great, I think, story of how technology works, the cost estimate of that first burger, $330,000. Wow. So that was an expensive, very expensive.
What kind of things did he spend that money on?
I think there was a lot of, getting the technology right, and the like was very expensive. But here's where we are now. There are 107 entrants into this marketplace, 107 startups in this space. They span 25 different countries. So this is not just a U.S. thing. Israel is also
it's
a big in there, and other countries as well. There's been over $1.3 billion invested in this space just in 2021, just in the last year. And there are big, ag tech companies like Tyson Foods and ADM who are getting into this and investing in it heavily. And the good news is we're down now from $330,000 to roughly $10 per burger.
Good or bad, depends on how you see it.
Yeah, and that's still expensive. I mean, I think your average McDonald's burger on a cost standpoint is going to be far, far less than that. But again, you're seeing a lot of interest and action of making this real. And again, we're starting to see some large-scale production facilities built. One of the first was built in Israel by futures meat technologies. There's one by California-based company that's going to open its facility in the U.S. in 2024. There's still challenges on scaling production. Access to cell lines is actually a big one. There's regulation to worry about here. The only country slash city that has approved the sale of lab-grown meat is Singapore. So you can go to Singapore and get your lab-grown burger at this point.
At the supermarket?
I'm not sure it's at the supermarket or like a high-end restaurant there. But I think, the heart of your question gets to probably the biggest challenge, which is this customer acceptance piece. So let me ask you straight up: Would you eat one if we could get one secured here? Would you eat one?
I'm not actually that sure. I'm not a big fan of veggie burgers either. I like my meat as you described.
Yeah.
I like the authentic feel of it. Maybe I would have to taste it first to decide and kind of get a sense for really how close it is, and just convince myself that it is the same thing.
So it's the taste then that's going to drive it.
It's the taste. Maybe it's something about the process. It's a good question. I would be very skeptical. But maybe it's partly because I'm unaware. So so can you describe a little bit more the process? Like, how do these beef burgers get created? How does this meat get created? And
well, now you're getting way beyond my technical expertise here. I envision some clean room lab with people walking around with little petri dishes, and I don't know, magic happens and out comes the meat. Actually, there, as often is the case with technology, science fiction portrayals of these things. So if you're a fan of the show Westworld, I forget, like season 3 or whatever, they actually had a portrayal of a plant that was a lab-grown meat facility. So you do see some of those. But what I'd like to do is actually bring in a guest expert for us today, who I hope and I imagine will have far more knowledge about this than I. So Elliot Schwartz is a PhD and lead scientist for cultivated meat at the Good Food Institute. The Good Food Institute is a nonprofit dedicated to advancing foundational open access research on alternative proteins, so clean meats, but others as well. And they're really trying to build the kind of innovation ecosystem to push forward these nascent technologies. So, Elliot, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Elliot, let's start with Yael's question to me that I don't have a good answer to. What exactly does this look like when you have a lab-grown meat production facility?
As you explained, lab-grown, or what our preferred term is, cultivated meat or cultured meat, the exact nomenclature is still being worked out, is indeed genuine animal meat that comes directly by cultivating animal cells rather than growing an entire animal itself. So the process generally begins by taking a small biopsy from a living animal or an animal that was recently slaughtered, where those cells can actually be viable and taken back to the lab. You can select for the type of cell that you want. So for instance, if you're making fat, you might take a fat biopsy, or if you're making muscle and meat, you'd take a muscle biopsy. Those cells can be selected for their ability to grow in certain conditions, typically in a medium that is composed of the things that cells need to survive: sugars, amino acids, vitamins, etc. And those cells are grown in a consecutive scale-up process in what's called a bioreactor, or more colloquially known as a cultivator. So think similar to a brewery in a stainless steel vessel. That's generally the sort of format or vision that these companies are going for. And those cells will be cultured at large scale. So you grow a lot of them in these vessels, and then eventually differentiate or transfer those cells into the principal components of meat. So muscle, fat, connective tissue that can form a variety of final products. So that's the general process, but happy to dive into any of those aspects a little deeper.
I'm curious about your metaphor here for like a brewery, because again, I went into it thinking more of like a clean room that you might see in a semiconductor plant. And to your point about I shouldn't be using lab, but cultivated meat here, is the brewery a better analogy of what these facilities will feel like when you're walking through them?
Yeah, that's correct. So I think, at the end of the day, this is food production. And we haven't necessarily grown animal cells in a fully food production environment. But we do fermentation like beer production or recombinant protein production for food and medicine in these sorts of environments. And so the vision there is really to make it look and feel like a brewery. In fact, some of the companies that you mentioned that have some of these pilot scale facilities opening in the Bay Area, they actually have windows in their facilities so that you can actually peer through the window and see how your meat is made. And I think a lot of companies really, put a lot of emphasis on that transparency compared to conventional meat production as a way to win over the consumer, to have them really up close to the production itself.
So thank you, Elliot, for sharing your knowledge. This is fascinating stuff. And, I'm a big fan of Sir David Attenborough and all his shows on TV, the nature shows. Are you familiar with those?
Absolutely, yes.
So, he's a brilliant presenter. And what would his take be? Does this mess around with our natural, evolutionary perspective on the world around us and the food chain and the biology? How does this maybe shift things or create some imbalances around us?
Well, I think I would argue on the contrary, that actually our conventional way of meat production has resulted in a lot of environmental imbalances. As Mike alluded to, meat production continues to rise as countries increase their GDP. So much so that it's predicted that by the year 2050 there could be 70 to 100% more global meat demand. Yet, it's already taken a toll on the environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of deforestation and land use, in terms of air and water pollution, etc. So the way that I sort of think about it, and some people actually refer to it as the fourth industrial or the fourth agricultural revolution. So,
agriculture 4.0, right?
So we domesticated animals 10,000 years ago or so. And, this is just a new way now that we have these sort of technologies to grow animal cells in this way, converging, a new way to create meat that hopefully will allow us to, sort of decouple the environmental impact and the resource demand from meat production.
And what about the cost? You mentioned, as both of you have mentioned a few times, that as GDP goes up, so as does the consumption of meat. But are these solutions going to be accessible to everybody in an equal way? One of the reasons in the U.S. that we all love our burger is that it's gotten so cheap and it's so easy to get in the hands of everybody who needs it. How about the clean meat or the cultivated meat? Will it be accessible to everybody?
Just before you answer that, Elliot, my understanding of meat consumption in the U.S. has also increased, greatly. Where it used to be, that special treat that you would have maybe one day a week, and now it's become, part of people's everyday diet in some cases. So that's a great point. But Elliot, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's correct. So per capita meat consumption, even in the U.S., continues to rise, and that's mostly due to chicken demand, even though beef and other meat forms have sort of remained stable. But on the cost aspect, I think I'll just back up and sort of frame the entire sort of alternative proteins category for your audience and how we sort of break these down on a different technologies. So the Good Food Institute, we focus on alternative proteins as a whole, and there's really three big categories within that. The first, as you mentioned, are these plant-based protein products, so like Impossible and Beyond Meat, that really aim to biomimic meat using plant-based ingredients. The second category is fermentation-derived food products, and that could be either using microbes as factories to produce high-value protein ingredients like casein or whey or heme protein, which is the ingredient in Impossible Burger, or it can also be used to create actually whole biomass from different microbes or fungi that can be used as ingredients or as whole meat substitute products. And then finally, the third category is the cultivated meat category, so growing actual animal cells into meat products. And so, these exist on different sort of trends in terms of technological development and readiness. With plant-based meat products, they're obviously already here on the market. Fermentation is a technology that is mature in other industries, but is just being sort of applied to the food industry and moving down that cost curve. And then cultivated meat is sort of newer. And so it comes at a higher cost. And that cost is still indeed quite high. So Mike, you mentioned, I think, a $10 burger. Some of these price points have been quoted in different news and media articles, but it's really actually hard at this point to pin down the exact cost of production. And a reason for that is that it's still very early in development. It's a very nascent industry. These sorts of pilot scale facilities are really still the test beds for enabling the scale up of the technology. Now, with that said, I think in the short term, these products that become commercialized, there'll be more and more sort of hybrid products. So just like the electric car, you started with a hybrid vehicle because it was going to be cheaper and more affordable to consumers. It's the same thing with these food products, where you can actually dilute the cost of a cultivated meat product with plant-based ingredients. So for instance, using 5% of cultivated animal fat in an otherwise plant-based product that will hopefully give it that sort of taste and that flavor of an animal product, but using just a fraction of the cells to dilute the cost. And so more and more we think that these technologies will blend together, and that can go a long way to making these more cost-effective and affordable to a broader range of consumers.
That reminds me, growing up, my mom was able to take a little bit of beef and then you add the hamburger helper to make it actually feed a whole family, which I think was kind of the similar concept for what you're saying here.
Exactly.
What about these alternative sources of protein? I mean, I brought up the grasshopper as kind of tongue in cheek, but it's like a company out of Israel that spoke to our students the other day around generating enough a little bit of protein from grasshoppers is enough to kind of fuel people for like a day.
I think it's like the protein per acre is
yes.
like huge, much greater magnitude than what you could grow.
Yeah, what you get from like chicken and stuff.
Yeah.
How does that fit in the equation here, Elliot?
Yeah, so I mean, we at GFI, we don't focus on insect-derived food products as real alternatives. Obviously, there are companies working on that, but we think, from a consumer perspective, we think the easiest way is to replicate meat from plants or to grow meat directly from cells. And that if you can do that in a way that enables those products to compete on price and on taste and on convenience, then you're going to have a winning scenario where consumers don't have to make significant behavioral changes. They can really swap in a product one for one. And I think the appeal of insects or consuming insects, especially in westernized countries, just seems less attractive, I guess, at this stage.
I'm curious about the learning curve here. You mentioned, and that's a common theme in our podcast here. When we talked about electric vehicles a few podcasts ago, I made this point that electric vehicles are simple machines. They're basically a battery stack and an electric motor. They don't have all the systems that need to go into an internal combustion engine, which gives me hope that as we drive down the cost of batteries, that electric vehicles will be, in fact, cheaper than internal combustion engines. Is there a similar argument here with cultivated meat? And what's in the back of my mind is like the value chain to have livestock, the amount of land it takes, again, the infrastructure, the food that has to go, the taking and culling the herds and processing. I mean, it is a vast infrastructure. Does this have the opportunity to be actually much cheaper once we get down the learning curve?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an open question for debate. I mean, it's true that from a thermodynamics perspective and efficiency perspective, feeding growing plants to feed to animals to then eat the animal is highly inefficient. And we can take those same plants and either eat them directly, or we can feed them to cells, which will just be slightly less efficient than eating the plants themselves. So just to give you a sense of what those numbers shake out to be, if you take a chicken, it takes 9 calories or so of food to get 1 calorie out. And with cell or cultivated meat, it's thought that that ratio is more 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. So you think that it would, from that perspective, it could be more cost effective in the long term. But the challenge is really that, you're going to need a lot of new infrastructure to enable this technology to scale up. And the main sort of driver, the bioreactor itself, is a large, expensive piece of equipment that has a high capital cost. And so I think, as this moves forward and more bioreactors need to be created, we can potentially create more efficient, fit-for-purpose bioreactors for use in the cultivated meat field. But also learning curves might be established in the manufacturing of these bioreactors themselves, similar to how we can get better at manufacturing batteries and other aspects of sort of core components of a value chain of a technology. So I think there's definitely opportunities there, but it's hard at this point to say, especially given how conventional meat is subsidized in various different ways, whether or not cultivated meat could really undercut the costs in a short or medium term.
You mentioned the capital cost of the equipment of the bioreactors. I'm curious, what are the operational costs? Is it water and energy, or what's needed to make these bioreactors work?
Yeah, so it is more energy intensive than conventional meat. To give your audience a sense of sort of the greenhouse gas breakdown, you mentioned at the top that a lot of animal agriculture's emissions are actually nitrous oxide and ammonia related emissions rather than CO2 or carbon emissions. Generally, CO2 emissions in a conventional meat value chain are maybe 10 to 20% of the total cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. But that ratio is actually flipped on its head for cultivated meats, where the vast majority of the emissions are the energy used at the facility itself. So it's more energy intensive, but the positive thing is that you can actually, use renewable energy to create this. And so you can hopefully decouple the sort of emissions from the actual process by quote unquote electrifying meat production.
Yeah,
So just one more thing to mention in terms of the main OpEx expenditure there for production is really the feedstock itself. So the raw materials that those cells consume, amino acids primarily, are going to be a cost driver in the long term.
I'm glad you mentioned the decarbonization of the electrical generation. It always bothers me when people are like, well, your electric vehicle is using, natural gas powered fire plants. The answer is yes, but we kind of know that to be able to decarbonize, we're going to need to electrify quite a bit. So it makes sense to me that heavy electrical use, but we could decarbonize with renewables.
I have a couple of really maybe different questions, or taking us in a slightly different direction. One is, tell me, is the FDA involved in the process in a similar way? I think that people like to know that somebody's approving and checking in on the quality of the food that they consume. Sometimes we care about that more than in others. I can imagine in an emerging field like this, all eyes would be on the approval and the regulators. What role do they play?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the way that the regulatory sort of landscape works in the United States is that the FDA will oversee the process from essentially the harvesting of the cells or the biopsy of the cells from the original animal all the way up until that cell is created into essentially a meat product. So when it's sort of harvested from the bioreactor itself, at which point the USDA will then take over the oversight because it sort of regulates the meat products themselves. So it's a joint regulatory framework. And indeed, there is a lot of scrutiny into how these products are going to be regulated. There are several companies right now in the United States that have sort of submitted their safety dossiers, which contain, the evidence and justification for why their products, they believe, are safe to market to consumers. And that is being evaluated, I think, as we speak, by FDA and USDA regulators. So certainly, there are new things about this, but at the end of the day, you are just creating meat. And so there's a lot of existing sort of knowledge and frameworks from the food system that can be sort of applied to cultivated meat regulation to ensure its safety, but just in a different way.
And so thank you so much. That is so helpful to know, and I think it's reassuring for many listeners to understand that whatever happens at the end of the day, this will, pick up and become more popularized as the regulators are on board as well. What about the ethical questions? Like, if we can do this for meat and for cows, like, where do we end? Like, I assume
you've already mentioned bear.
Well, I'm sure that we can do it for other animals, but okay, so now we're going to move on to a very controversial field related to people and individuals and humans, right? How does the ethics come into play, and what kind of pushback do you guys hear out there?
Yeah, so I think the Soylent Green, eating human meat is certainly a fun thing to entertain from the technology. But of course, I don't think any regulatory agency would really approve that, nor company really pursue that as a route rather than just a thought exercise. But otherwise, you are correct. This sort of opens the ability to create entirely new meat products, because the meat that we eat today is sort of more representative of the animals that we were able to domesticate thousands of years ago. They're not necessarily the tastiest animals, or the ones that people would enjoy eating if they were given more choices. So there actually are some companies in the sector that are exploring more sort of production of exotic meats through this process, or combining different aspects of a animal product together. So for instance, why not have a burger with duck fat in it if we can use duck fat as an ingredient in whatever we'd like? So really the whole spectrum of animal products can be created using cells. And this extends not just to meat, but also to milk products. So you can actually grow milk using mammary cells from different mammals. There are companies working on that for both human and animal milk products. And then you can create other sort of agricultural products. People are applying this to grow cocoa cells to create, chocolate products, or keratin to replace rhino horn on the market. All of these sort of ideas, like if it comes from an animal, you can apply this technology in this way to replace it.
I might be able to get behind chocolate meat. I'm a big chocolate fan. I don't know. I'm still trying to process.
I was going to say it gives a whole other meaning to the turducken idea. Right? Just
because there's a new movie out in the Jurassic Park franchise here, is it feasible that you could resurrect like a woolly mammoth burger, or dare I say a T-Rex burger, or is that just in the realm of science fiction?
That's where you need the biopsy, right? I was listening. The biopsy.
Well, that's why I'm asking.
Right, exactly.
But, it's the wax that had kept the mosquito that had bit the.
There was actually an April Fool's article of a company that came out that allegedly raised $100 million to make mammoth meat. But yeah, it was an April Fool's joke, and unfortunately, there's no bank of sort of viable mammoth cells. But if there were, one could potentially do that.
Elliot, I know that you've kind of listened to one of our episodes before, and you know that at some point in the conversation, we turn to the question of good disruption, bad disruption, or no disruption. We've heard a lot about the good. We've heard some concerns, but like if you were to say what might make people feel like this is a bad disruption, what would be the main things on their list?
Yeah, I guess some of the things that I read about and online or hear about is that essentially, this opens the door to, patent food in ways that would just sort of entrench more power, corporate power in the food system, which is generally, not what people want from their food. When they think about, the ideal food environment, they want it to be, something that they know where it came from, maybe it's local, they know who grew it, that's sort of the ideal version of the world. So entrenchment of corporate power is certainly, I think, a concern that some people have about these technological approaches to food production.
Yeah, it goes against the farm to table idea, right? Like going against that whole.
Well, yeah, that's actually a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about, which is one of the things that makes agriculture so hard to kind of manage when it comes to, let's say, decarbonization, is it is so diffuse. Millions of farmers out there, various scales and the like. If there is significant economies to scale in cultivated meat production, yeah, the logical outcome would be we'd have a handful probably of very large meat producing companies in the world. And how does that change our thinking about the industry? Elliot,
I will just say, like, this hopefully will be developed, in tandem with careful policies to, ensure equitability, that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of potential for that reality that we just described to not exist. But, we do have to be mindful of that possibility. And really, we have the opportunity to build this new sort of meat production system. So, as long as hopefully we're conscious of that throughout this process, that will likely take decades, to fully materialize, we could create a much better world.
I'm curious, we haven't talked about that timing issue here. There's obviously a lot of things going on, a lot of investment in products even coming out now. But when do you think, if this goes to fruition, we'll be sitting at our McDonald's eating a cultivated meat product? I mean, are we a few years away? Are we a decade away? And I'm also curious, like, does this include things like filet mignon? Can I get a higher end cut of meat through the cultivated meat process?
Yeah, so I'll take your second question first. And I think, obviously the end goal is to create the whole spectrum of meat products. But as you might imagine, creating a fully marbled steak is a harder task than creating a chicken nugget. Mm-hmm. So I think generally the unstructured types of products are the things that we see onto market first. And that is the case in Singapore, where the product is a chicken nugget, which is composed of, by the way, 70% animal cells and 30% plant ingredients. So it is a hybrid product, the one that's currently for sale. In terms of, expectations for consumers, I think, the facilities that are being built before you described as large scale, but I'd actually say that, they're really small scale when you think about it on the food system. So their output is somewhere in the, hundreds of thousands of pounds per year. And we consume as a global society, over 350 million metric tons of meat products per year, not even counting seafood. So, we have a long ways to go to scale up to the, food production sorts of levels. But what consumers can expect in the short term is that these facilities, these smaller facilities that are opening now, will really coincide with small scale commercial releases that can, serve a couple of restaurants. Maybe, by the end of this decade, start to enter into higher end retail, grocery stores and things like that. But there is, challenges into scaling from a scientific perspective that I think will need to be solved before you're really buying a fully cultivated meat burger at your McDonald's, for instance.
So let's get back to our big question to wrap up here. Elliot. Good disruption, bad disruption, no disruption. Well,
I'm a little biased, but I think certainly, this has enormous potential for good disruption. And I'll just mention, outside of the things that we talked about today in terms of, sort of environmental impact, I do want to note that, there are other sort of existential threats that this sort of intersects with. So, for instance, conventional meat production is the number one source of zoonotic disease threats. So, pandemic risk is highly elevated if we keep animals in confined conditions as we do today. And this would essentially eliminate, that possibility if alternative proteins were become no longer alternative. Additionally, global antibiotic use, about 3/4 of antibiotics are fed to livestock and other animals in confined conditions, not humans. And that is a major driver of antibiotic resistance threats. And actually, contrary to sometimes what people believe, you don't actually need to use any antibiotics in the production of cultivated beet or any other alternative protein. So I think this sort of technology has potential to mitigate a lot of, long-standing global threats to, human health, the environment, et cetera. So if it does pan out, I think it will be an extremely good disruption for humanity.
Well, you've convinced me. I'm coming down, Yael, on good disruption here.
I think you walked in here with good disruption on your mind.
I'm off in good disruption, but I think this has some real potential. But you came in skeptical here. You came in like you were not going to ever eat a cultivated meat product. So where do you stand?
Yeah. So listening to both of you, my sense is that I come down on it as a good disruption, but not maybe for the same reasons. Like for me, the good disruption assessment comes from the idea that the technology, the investment, the thought process, and all of these efforts, I think opens the doors to a lot of solutions to other problems that we might have around us. A little bit as Elliot suggested, we're trying to solve a multifaceted problem here related to how we live our lives right now. And clearly we've been pushing the extremity of our systems, to a place where they're out of balance, and we need to gain control. And by having new technologies and new opportunities, I think we'll find our way. Whether I'm going to sit down and eat a cultivated beef burger, I don't know. But I think that there's enough substitutes and enough creativity being put into it that I think eventually we'll have a much larger variety to enable us as individuals to find better paths forward.
Yeah, I had one last, factoid to this discussion, which is by most projections, we're going to grow from about 7 billion people to about 10 billion people over the next 30 years. How are we going to feed that many people in the world, especially when there's constraints on the amount of land use we can use for agriculture, and then of course you're adding climate change and other pressures on the environment. We need a fourth agricultural revolution, as Elliot suggested, and perhaps this is it.
We need to change our habits too, and we need to be more aware of the shortcomings of our decisions, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Elliot, for joining us today. Really appreciated your expertise. As always, thank you to Gary, our producer, and to Becky, our cultivated meat enthusiast and also researcher extraordinaire. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Good Disruption.
Good Disruption is a podcast from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.